Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. This is the fourth Zoom presentation of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. Tonight, our speaker is Jim Mackin, who will present his new book, Notable New Yorkers of Manhattan's Upper West Side, Bloomingdale and Morningside Heights. Before I introduce Jim, I'm happy to report that the History Group is busy at work planning more presentations for the new year. In January, on the 21st of January, we'll be offering an evening with Heidi Newmark, who's the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church on 100th Street. Heidi has a new book called Sanctuary, and it's about her work, how her church and its members seized upon and grappled with the issues of our times in our neighborhood, from AIDS to gentrification, a changing population and a changing neighborhood. We'll be sending out information on that as soon as we have the time and everything set. It'll be an evening presentation, just like tonight is in January on the 21st. Later, we may be revisiting Matthew Spady, whose historical work and research takes us a bit north to Audubon Park neighborhood. You can find out more about us on our website, upperwestsidehistory.org. If you add your name to our mailing list, you'll hear about our programs in advance. While our Zoom capacity is limited to about 100, thankfully, we're able to add more presentation through a YouTube link. And if you miss the presentation, it'll be on YouTube a couple of hours after it finishes, accessible through our website. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Mackin, one of our stalwart members of the History Group's planning team. You may know Jim already, as he has presented many programs at our evening meetings that used to be at the hostel. We've learned from Jim more about the 9th Avenue L and the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum and much, much more. Or you may know Jim from his lively walking tours of the Bloomingdale neighborhood, an activity we hope will return one day soon. Jim is known for digging deep into our history, sharing stories of Bloomingdale and Morningside Heights and places. And when he finds a musical note, he produces his guitar and he sings about it. Now Jim has added to his work of uncovering the history of our neighborhood by producing his first book, becoming the first published author in our history group. We're all very proud of his accomplishment and eager to hear more from Jim this evening about the notables of the Upper West Side. Okay, Jim.
Okay. Thank you, Pam. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And help. Hi there. Thank you again, Pam, and Michael Gonzalez, who's behind the scenes kind of running the show. Pam, Michael, and I are only 3 of 14 people in the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, which Pam told you about. So good evening and welcome to a presentation about my book. Let me show you a picture of it. I'm going to do share. Okay, I've got to share the screen. And here we go. Okay, this is my book. So it's called Notable New Yorkers of Manhattan's Upper West Side, Bloomingdale, Morningside Heights. Now, let me adjust your expectations for this evening. We're not going to cover well-known notables like Humphrey Bogart, the Gershwins, Ray Charles, Madonna, Duke Ellington, John Dewey, Billie Holiday, the list goes on and on and on. But instead, we're going to pick out a few a couple of chestnuts, lesser known notables that are in the book. So let's get started with 2 notables. See if anybody ever heard of Morton Sobel. Lifelong communist Morton Sobel was part of a 3-person spy ring that included 2 other people. I'm sure you recognize their names, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They got the electric chair. Sobel got time in Alcatraz, and he was released in 1969 after serving 17 years. Curiously, he met union boss Jimmy Hoffa, gangster Frank Costello in Alcatraz. In the early 1970s, he took courses in electronics at Columbia, and he taught at Brooklyn Poly Institute while writing his memoir called Undoing Time. And from the time he was arrested in 1952, Sobel maintained his innocence until he changed his mind in the 2008 interview with the New York Times, in which he also implicated the Rosenbergs. He's a Bronx native. He graduated from City College with an engineering degree. He lived right down the block from me at 309 West 109th Street. The second notable I want to tell you about spent the last part of his life at the Jewish Home and Hospital on West 106th Street. See if you recognize this name, Milt Gabler. He born in Harlem, Gabler began in the record business by working in his uncle's Commodore music shop, which specialized in jazz records on West 42nd Street. In 1937, he set up his own record store on 52nd Street, and he soon established the Commodore Records Company. Gabler produced Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit on his Commodore record label, and that's after Columbia Records chose not to record it. Many of you will know how important that recording was, and many of you will know that Strange Fruit referred to lynching of African Americans. In 1942, Gabler co-wrote, along with Lionel Hampton and Benny Goodman, a tune called Flying Home. Some rock and roll purists argue that a particular recording of that song is the first real, true rock and roll record. That's a little bit debatable, but in 1954, at Decca Records, he produced the 1955 hit record Rock Around the Clock with Bill Haley and the Comets. It was recorded at the Pythian Temple on West 70th Street, which is still there, a great Thomas Lamb building. In 1993, Milt Gabler was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by his nephew, the comedian Billy Crystal. So there's so many remarkable things about him. The New York Times reported that when Gabler died, the only photo on his bedside was that of Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday, incidentally, is in the book, New York Notables. So the two notables I've showed you so far, Morton Sobel and Milt Gabler, are not in the book. Let me repeat, they're not in the book. They're not in Notable New Yorkers of the Upper West Side, Bloomingdale, Morningside Heights for good reason. I have found over 1,400 notables who resided in our neighborhood, and we couldn't fit them in the book. I didn't want my book to be confused with a telephone directory. The book, which is big enough today, more than 400 pages, features 591 notables. When you buy the book, and I hope you do, the book has information to direct you to the website, which has the additional 847 notables who resided in our neighborhood. For every notable in the book and on the website, there's a short biography along with the addresses where they lived. The book is arranged into 5 geographic sections: the West 90s, the West 100s, the West 120s, the West 110s, and Riverside Drive. Within each section, there are notables in address order, so you can easily find where the notables lived on your street. And the book has photographs, such as this one, West End Avenue at 100th Street, looking north. A couple of curious things about this, and my friend and another associate, Gil Tauber, who's probably listening in. Gil's another one of the 14 Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members, would probably point out more than I will, but notice there's a car in the middle of the street. Well, in 1910, there were no traffic lights, there were no lanes, there was no nothing. You just drove up and down the street, I guess. Notice also between the sidewalk and the street, there's bushes and greenery. Clearly that's not there anymore. And you might also notice the roof line, the height of the buildings, that is approximately 6 or 7 stories, never higher. Today, West End Avenue, which is all landmarked as a historic district, most of the buildings are top out at 15 stories. So my book, I'm so proud to be published by Fordham University Press. Their Empire Editions is very well known for their local history books. In very recent times, I think in the last year or so, they've published a book on the history of the American Museum of Natural History by Colin Devi. One of my favorite books, Reading Publics, History of the New York City Libraries. There are a bunch of them before they all got kind of consolidated into New York Public Library. And I'm a constant user of the private New York Society Library. Only in New York, which is a book by Sam Roberts and Pete Hamill, is a gem. Another favorite, Josh Raskin's The Routes Not Taken, a book about planned but unbuilt subways. And at least two authors, there may be more from Fordham's list, their Empire editions, have presented at our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. Thomas Shelley presented Upper West Side Catholics. Bill Sorrell presented Angels of Mercy. And as Pam mentioned, and I have it right here, my new favorite book, and maybe a little glare here, I apologize, is The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot, which will be the definitive history of Audubon Park for years to come by Matthew Spady. So let's begin with a few notables who are in the book. To fully enjoy the presentation of my book, The Notable New Yorkers of Manhattan's Upper West Side, Bloomingdale, Morningside Heights, please loosen any restrictive clothing and make sure you're either seated or in a stable position. Let's see if everyone recognizes this woman. Notice she died fairly recently, 1991. Nan Britton was the mistress of President Warren G. Harding. In 1927, after Harding's death in office, Nan Britton wrote what is thought by many to be the first kiss and tell book, The President's Daughter. It received much attention at the time and much skepticism until recently. Britton claimed to have been intimate with Harding for several years in Ohio when he was governor, as well as during his presidency. She maintained that they were intimate in the White House, and then after she moved to New York City, they had dalliances in Central Park and Riverside Park. Why they missed Morningside Park is beyond me. DNA testing, you might have read in the paper a few years ago, has recently confirmed that Miss Britton's claim that Warren G. Harding fathered her daughter, Elizabeth, was true. Let's move on to another notable. He died in near obscurity in a basement room given to him by the building superintendent at the Manchester apartment building, which many of us know, at 255 West 108th Street. And that is the great Hank Jones. After Hank Jones died, the New York Times was astute enough to write an article about his situation at the time of his death. And they reminded us of his greatness. Jones was born into a musically talented family in Mississippi, but he was raised in Michigan, where he started playing professionally by age 13. When he came to New York City in 1944, he played with the likes of Andy Kirk, Coleman Hawkins, who lived in our neighborhood and is in the book, and Billy Eckstein. From 1948 to 1953, he was Ella Fitzgerald's constant pianist. He was also part of the bebop scene. He recorded with Charlie Parker and Max Roach. Max Roach is in the book. He was the house pianist at Savoy Records, and he was the staff pianist for CBS Studios, which included such responsibilities as backing Frank Sinatra on The Ed Sullivan Show. Talk about responsibility. In the 1970s, he was the conductor and pianist for the Broadway musical Ain't Misbehavin'. Hank Jones's brothers were jazz notables, and they both lived in our neighborhood, and they're both in the book. The trumpet player, Thad Jones, and the drummer, Elvin Jones, who lived on 105th Street. It is a most interesting footnote to history, however, and I hope you don't remember Hank Jones just for this one little footnote tidbit, but when Marilyn Monroe sang Happy Birthday to President Kennedy in 1963 in Madison Square Garden, it was Hank Jones playing the piano. Well, I bet you didn't know that we had two notable Ginsbergs in the neighborhood. Allen Ginsberg, and that's spelled B-E-R-G, and he lived on 114th and 115th Street, and Ruth Bader Ginsberg, who lived on 116th Street at number 404 West. And I'll digress for just a moment. When the book was going, it had been completely edited and it was going to press, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed. And my editors were fabulous in being able to get in her death year for the book purposes of the book. I had one or two other issues at the very end. One had to do with Nina Simone just validating her address on Riverside Drive, 336 Riverside Drive. And I was able to validate it at the very last minute. She comes to mind because she's one of 4 people that I talk about that are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You don't think of Nina Simone as a rock and roll performer, but she was so sensational and so eclectically different and dynamic that she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I already mentioned MILT, GABLER, and the other 2 are Madonna and Carole King. And speaking of Supreme Court justices or associate justices, Neil Gorsuch is not in the book, even though recently, thanks to our friend Bob Piggott, another fellow who did a wonderful presentation for us at the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group on his book, New York's Legal Landmarks. Bob got information for me as to where Neil Gorsuch lived in the neighborhood on 114th Street. But speaking of RBG and Gorsuch, we had quite a few Supreme Court justices residing in the book. On the cover, of course, is the great, it's a young picture of him, but he's a very handsome man, even in his later years, the great Thurgood Marshall. We also had Nobel Prize winners, the likes of a number of which you wouldn't believe, Pulitzer Prize winners, half a dozen suffragists. You could see I go back in time a bit. So many jazz greats, Ellington, Roach, Coltrane, opera singers, Rosa Ponzell, Geraldine Farrar. I mean, these are people at the top of their game, top of their realm, composers and lyricists. And in fact, at the end of 2019, at the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, we partnered with a bunch of people to do a Tin Pan Alley program just based on the composers and lyricists in our neighborhood. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, Jim, the notables you showed us so far have been very entertaining, but do you have any motion picture industry notables? Well, just a few. Harry Marvin, who invented Mutoscope, Cecil B. DeMille, D.W. Griffith, pioneer, invented the close-up, the long shot, so many other things I write about. Jesse Lasky, Adolf Zucker, who are the foundations for Paramount Pictures. Samuel Goldfish, who changes his name to Samuel Goldwyn. He's the Goldwyn in MGM. Marcus Lowe, who created MGM. Carl Laemmle, who started Universal Pictures. And we have 3 of the 4 people that started United Artists. We don't have Charlie Chaplin, but we have D.W. Griffith, John Barrymore, and Mary Pickford. And then I stretched the boundaries of the book. I started out at 93rd Street, but I stretched it to 92nd Street, only to include a man whose name should be known to give a little more context to Fox News and 20th Century Fox, and that is the great film pioneer, William Fox. He was pretty much out of the business by 1930 with bankruptcy, but he lived on 92nd Street. So in addition to the 591 notables in my book, there are numerous tidbits of uncommon history peppered throughout the book. And there's some maps and photographs, such as this one. Here's a picture of the 98th Street Water Tower, part of the Croton Aqueduct system. When we do neighborhood walking tours of the neighborhood, we occasionally touch upon the Croton Aqueduct, which kind of came right through our neighborhood. In fact, Pam Tice, who introduced me, did a wonderful blog on the wall of Bloomingdale, I think she called it, which showed some of the physical features of the Croton Aqueduct, including this, but also the Clendenning Viaduct, which went over Clendenning Valley. That's a name you don't hear anymore. So John Clendenning's in the book. You can read about him. And then I found out in my research, this is curious, the great Oscar Hammerstein II, and incidentally, both Oscar Hammersteins are in the book. Oscar Hammerstein I, who built a lot of opera theaters and much, much else, and Oscar Hammerstein II, who wrote Oklahoma, worked with Richard Rodgers' Oklahoma and Sound of Music and all those other great musicals, King and I. Oscar Hammerstein II's full name is Oscar Greeley Clendenning Hammerstein. So read the book and find out about why Oscar Hammerstein has the name Clendenning in his name. The 98th Street Water Tower, and you could kind of, in your mind, contrast it with the High Bridge Tower, which has been getting a lot of attention recently as they completed the High Bridge walkway from Manhattan to the Bronx. In my book, Notable New Yorkers, I use 4 symbols. One symbol identifies a notable that's especially interesting. Another symbol identifies that they need to be much better appreciated. A third symbol mentions that they're plaque-worthy. And a fourth symbol indicates that they are stars. That means they're at the top of their game. So curiously enough, there's only 8 people in the book that get all 4 legends. And let me show you one of them, and you probably won't recognize the name. So to be in this category of getting 4 legends, that means you have to be a star, you got to be plaque worthy, you got to be especially interesting, and you need to be much, much better appreciated. About 2 years ago, a plaque went up on the side of her building. The building is the Della Robbia at 740 West End Avenue. And I'm talking about Teresa Carreño. Teresa was the most famous woman concert pianist in her day. She performed for Abraham Lincoln. She's Venezuelan. Her virtuosity tagged her as Valkyrie on the piano. Born in Venezuela to a musical family, she came to the United States in 1862, performed many, many concerts, studied with the extraordinary Anton Rubinstein. Some people say he's the greatest pianist ever. And under America's first great composer, Louis Gottschalk. She was also a teacher of the 14-year-old Edward McDowell. He's in the book. He taught at Columbia, but he's renowned in his own right. And I'm sure you've all heard of the McDowell Colony up in New Hampshire. But Teresa Carreño is especially noted for performing the great piano concertos, the common ones, the Liszt, the Tchaikovsky, but especially her rendition of the Grieg piano concerto in A minor. In 1865, she traveled to Europe to do more concerts, and she met Charles Gounod, Franz Liszt, Giacomo Rossini. In fact, Rossini gave her voice lessons. She took on operatic roles after that and actually performed in Mozart's Don Giovanni and Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots. In her later life, she composed some 75 works for piano, voice, choir, and orchestra. In Venezuela, in Caracas, the Teresa Carreño Cultural Complex is the home of the Venezuelan Symphony Orchestra. Truly a star. There were 2 other notables in her building over time. There was the actress Peggy Lipton, if you remember her in Mod Squad, or that kind of cult favorite series, Blue Velvet. And then another notable in her building, I'll jump ahead to, is Benny Leonard. Among boxers of all weight categories, Leonard is usually ranked 6th, 7th, or 8th. That is, in all of history, all boxers ever, he comes out pretty high up. And amongst lightweight boxers, he is usually ranked number 1. Born Benjamin Liner, Lower East Side, he was educated in the School of Hard Knocks. Legend has it in 1911, at the age 15, he couldn't afford to attend a boxing match. So he climbed on the skylight above the ring and he fell through the skylight and he couldn't pay for the broken glass. So he offered to replace a fighter who failed to show up, and he won the fight. His success rebuts the jokes about lack of Jewish sports stars, believe me. From 1912 to 1932, that's a 20-year period, he only lost 1 fight out of 70. 1 fight out of 89, and that was a disqualification. 70 of the 89 were won by knockouts. He died of a heart attack while refereeing a boxing match down on 66th Street, the old St. Nicholas Arena, parts of which are embedded in ABC studios. So he's another good one to read about. And the next fella, let me show you. Robert G. Thompson, he lives in my building. I live in 370 Riverside Drive. We have a few people in the book from 370 Riverside Drive. Robert G. Thompson's the fella on the left. The fella on the right is Benjamin Davis. You might recognize that name. He was a New York City councilman for 2 terms, and he was secretary of the Communist Party. Interesting story. He was born in Oregon, joined the Communist Party as a teenager in Oakland. After working 2 years, he traveled to Moscow, participated in the Young Communist International Congress, went to Spain, joined the International Brigade, commanded a battalion there. And then he came back to the United States, became secretary of the Young Communist League, and he was eventually selected to the party's national board. After Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Thompson joined the United States Army. His actions in the Southwest Pacific earned him a Distinguished Service Cross. But in 1948, a federal grand jury indicted him as chairman of the New York State Communist Party, along with 10 other members on the national board. The charge was a violation of the Smith Act, which prohibited teaching or advocating overthrow of the government by force or violence. At this point, his life story starts to become the makings of a compelling movie. He received the lightest sentence of 3 years in prison because of his war record. But rather than show up to begin his sentence, he obtained false identification papers. He grew a mustache. He dyed his hair strawberry blonde, and he holed up in a secluded cabin 8,000 feet up in the Sierra Mountains near Sonora, California. But the FBI captured him and a comrade without a shot, and they sent him off to Alcatraz. Curiously enough, he was in Alcatraz the same time as Morton Sobel and Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Costello. While in the federal house of detention in New York, awaiting trial for a related charge, a fellow inmate attacked him with a lead pipe for no apparent reason and cracked his skull. After his release from prison in 1960, he lived quietly in my building, 370 Riverside Drive, until he died at age 50 from a heart attack. By the way, a shout out to 370 Riverside Drive resident Steve McClure. Steve was the first reader of Notable New Yorkers to notice that the notables who lived in 370 Riverside Drive miraculously appear on page 370. So let's digress again. Maps are fun. Here's, I'll take one of the maps in my book. Here's a map from about 1890. I'll point out a few things with my cursor. Sometimes, and Pam's written blogs about this, the Lion Brewery. In fact, Gil Tauber and I were just talking about, just trading emails today about the Lion Brewery. Across the street, across 9th Avenue at the time, they had a beer garden for their employees. You could also see the name of the Bloomingdale Road here, and that follows right down this way. And then sometimes what I like to do is just zoom in, and I'll just point out just maybe one thing here, which is simply this home for the aged. Whoops. This home for the aged here is the Richard Morris Hunt landmark building from 1884, which housed the Association for Respectable Aged and Indigent Females.
And so I was going to add, the building that's pictured there is without its 1913 extension. So now the building takes the whole block. But if you look at the building and you wonder why the front porch is off center, it's because the front porch was on the original building and then the building was extended.
Aha. Pam, I think it's time for you to talk about the association again in a full-fledged presentation.
Right.
So let's take a look at this fella. We've only got a few notables left. I'm a big fan of Jill Lepore. She's a historian at Harvard, a prolific author of books, and you may have noticed her name recently, in fact, quite frequently, in the New Yorker magazine. She was featured at the New York Historical Society last year, and she was a spectacular success. She's just a great presenter and just incredibly dynamic. She wrote a biography of this guy. Let me tell you about William Marston. He was born in Massachusetts, graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard, and got an undergraduate degree, got a second undergraduate degree in law, and then went on and got his doctorate, his PhD. In 1915, he invented the lie detector, but it got refined by another fella to become the modern polygraph machine. Marston taught at American University in Washington, D.C., also at Tufts, and he taught and then he started teaching psychology at NYU and Columbia, but Columbia booted him out. There were issues with him. His psychological beliefs centered around the essence of females versus males. He seemed to hold that women were stronger than men, yet submission and eroticism were central to his live, love, and laugh doctrine. Marston, his wife, and his mistress lived in a menage a trois. Both his wife and his mistress actually had children by him, and they were cared for communally. But Jill Lepore's book about William Marston recounts a very interesting life for sure, but the title of the book reveals the name of the comic book heroine that he invented. And the name of her book is The Secret History of Wonder Woman. So you might be wondering, are there any other notable cartoonists in the book? And indeed, there are. It's kind of a silly question, if I might put it that way. There's George Harriman. You probably didn't hear of him, but he invented he was the cartoonist of Crazy Cat. Crazy Cat was the first comic strip to be taken seriously as an art form by intellectuals, and had great influence on Art Spiegelman, Robert Crumb, Charles Schulz. Another great cartoonist from the neighborhood, 98th and West End Avenue, was Stan Lee. Stan Lee gave us Iron Man, Doctor Strange, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Black Panther, the Avengers, Captain America, and Spider-Man. And he became head of Marvel Comics. He just died 2 years ago. And then there's Rube Goldberg. In 1915, Goldberg was earning $50,000 a year, probably the most popular cartoonist in the country at the time. His memorable cartoons included Lollapalooza, Ike and Mike, They Look Alike, and Boob McNutt. But another one of his creations was Professor Lucifer Gonzala Butts. He is the character who made those ridiculously complicated thingamajigs that made mockeries of simplicity. They are now generally and respectfully known as Rube Goldberg contraptions. So we only have two more notables that I want to show you. So let's move to the next one. The next one was a congressman in our area from 1923 to 1949. And he lived, as you can see, in the master apartment building. That should be singular master. I tried to trace our current congressman back to Isidore Straus, and it proved to be quite a challenge just because of redistricting, but I did it. But I'll take you from Congressman Jerry Nadler back to Saul Bloom quite easily. Before Nadler, there was Theodore Ted Weiss. Everybody remembers Ted. Before him, Bella Abzug. Before him, William Fitz Ryan. He's in my book. Ted Weiss is in my book. And Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. He's also in my book. And then before Roosevelt Jr. was Saul Bloom. So Saul Bloom chaired the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in 1939, from 1939 on. He oversaw the George Washington Bicentennial in 1932 and the US Constitution Sesquicentennial Exposition in 1937. His specialty were foreign affairs. He had a strong Zionist bent and much involved in the creation of the United Nations. But in his earlier life, he was a theatrical stage manager. He actually staged boxing matches, including one with the world champion gentleman Jim Corbett. When he was in Chicago, he was the branch manager for M. Whitmark and Sons, the largest publisher of sheet music in the country. But in 1903, he came to New York and was successful in theater and real estate. He left his Chicago Republican Party roots and he joined the Democratic Party of Tammany Hall in New York City, and he got elected to Congress in 1923. He wrote a fabulous autobiography that recounts an amazing life. And show you how amazing it is, I'm forgetting to mention that at age 23, he was hired to run the mile-long Midway amusement venue of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair. Some of you know Eric Larson's Devil in the White City, which tells a story that takes place there. With Sol Bloom's responsibility for the Midway, one of the attractions that he offered was an exotic dancer known as Little Egypt. And she performed the Hoochie Coochie dance. From that, unless we don't forget, Congressman Sol Bloom is thought to have been the person who introduced belly dancing to the United States. So let's go to our final notable. But before we do that, let's show you one more image in the book. It's a picture of the Leakin Watts Orphanage, which is where the Cathedral of St. John the Divine and the cathedral close are today. This photograph was taken about 1895. And Pam, you and I think it began with you. We a little bit of a mystery with the cemetery nearby. Do you want to?
Oh, yes. Someone found that on an old 1860s map that there was a graveyard at the corner of Columbus Avenue and 110th Street, the northeast corner, if I remember correctly. And we did some hunting to see whose graveyard.
And we're still hunting.
Well, it was Leakin Watts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not all the children lived through their time there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, so in case you don't know, I'm going to add just a few minor details. This part of the Leakin Watts Orphanage is still on the grounds. It's actually, I think, the oldest physical structure in the neighborhood from 1843. Behind it, you could see the cranes that are being used to erect the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Mm-hmm. And a little bit to the right of that, I can't see it because of images here, but is the dome. Oh, here it is, the dome on the top of Ernest Flagg's St. Luke's Hospital. And down here, you see this bare rock, which you could have seen up until about within maybe like 10 years ago. In 1890, they had to blast through the ridge here to create 110th Street. So let's move on to our last notable. You've been so patient and bearing with all this detail. Here she is, one of my favorites, true favorites, Eleanor Smith. Smith was married to a New York State assemblyman. His name was Patrick H. Sullivan. She was born Eleanor Regina Patricia Ward in New York City, but she changed her last name after her father, who was an actor, changed his name to Tom Smith. He traveled the vaudeville circuit and used airplanes. When she was only 6 years old, her father strapped her into an airplane and took off from a potato patch on Long Island. In 1927, when she was only 16 years old, Orville Wright helped her get an international flying license. In 1929, she set the woman's flying endurance record, being in the air for 13 and a half hours. She bested it the next year by being in the air for 26 and a half hours. She set the woman's altitude record in 1930, flying above 27,000 feet. Within a year, she bested that by flying above 32,000 feet. In 1934, she became the first woman on a Wheaties cereal box. But I hope you remember her for something that I write about in the book she did in 1928 that no one has done since. Mayor Jimmy Walker had to intercede to prevent the suspension of her flying license after she flew an airplane under all 4 East River bridges. Eleanor Smith, one of the 591 notables in notable New York's of Manhattan's Upper West Side, Bloomingdale, Morningside Heights. Thank you very much. Now I show you this because people are asking me, first of all, how do they get the book? And I think the best way to get it is from Fordham University Press. You could see down below, and if you Google them, you would get there also. And if you use the code Upper West Side UWS 20 at the checkout, you'll get a 20% discount. But the book, I know, is also in Book Culture, and it's on at least the websites of Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all the major bookstores. This time of the year would make for a wonderful holiday gift. Certainly anybody who enjoys uncommon history or trivia, because I pepper the book with a lot of uncommon history and trivia. Anyone who wants to learn more about underappreciated notables, and especially there's a fair number of African Americans and women in the book. That was conscious on my part. Anyone who went to Columbia, Barnard, Teachers College, I think would love this book. There's so many references to those schools, so many notables that came from there. And of course, anybody who lives in the neighborhood in our Bloomingdale, Morningside Heights area, that would be fabulous. So on behalf of Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, on behalf of Pam Tice, on behalf of Michael Gonzalez, who has made tonight possible behind the scenes, thank you very much. I hope you've learned a few things about the Upper West Side, our neighborhood, and that my book, Notable New Yorkers, encourages you to find out more about our amazing neighborhood. Thank you, and good health to you and all your loved ones.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, and you're invited, I'll go back for a second, to come to the Hungarian pastry shop. The owner there, Phil, I wrote most of the book at the Hungarian pastry shop, so it's payback time. Myself and my copy editor, Kathy Bernard, met there a lot to do a lot of the book. So right out in front of the Hungarian pastry shop, on the seat, on the street, because the street is closed on Saturdays and Sundays, I'll be the guy sitting there freezing with wearing a mask and having a table with a pile of books. And if you already have the book, please come by and I'd love to sign it. And if you don't, you could buy a copy there or whatever. So thank you again. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, Jim. Good show.
Great talk, Jim. So we have a few questions from people.
Okay.
The first one is, who was the hardest person to cut from the book?
The hardest person to cut from the book. Oh, that's an excellent question. Boy, I think a little bit hard about that. I know there are a few people I again almost cut Nina Simone if I couldn't validate her, but my good friend Peter Salwin, who wrote Upper West Side Story, which is still the best comprehensive book about our neighborhood, convinced me, and I found some other stuff. He convinced me and to leave her in, and we validated it. But leaving out, that's a tough one.
Well, if you want to come back to it, we can go to the next question and then come back to that one. So Michael Michonne wanted to know how you would properly pronounce the Lowe's movie, how I pronounce Lowe's, but he said that his parents used to pronounce it as low res, which he was told was the proper pronunciation. Do you have any?
I would bet my last paycheck that Michael's right. Michael, in case people know, was borough historian of Manhattan for many, many years, and a great inspiration to me. I would defer to that. I know if you lived in the Bronx and you were familiar with one of those famous you refer to Lowe's.
Right, Lowe's. Yeah, he corrected himself later on. Lowe's.
And there was some out in Queens and Brooklyn as well. In fact, the one in Brooklyn, the Prospect, I think opened up again a few years ago with Barbara Streisand. So and we had one on Broadway at 83rd Street. So. But Michael, I suspect, is absolutely correct. He's his deep knowledge is much deeper than mine.
Okay, yeah. So that, yeah, I think Louise was what he was saying before. So far, that's the only. Oh, and then Mark Paul wanted to know what's your favorite notable so far.
Oh, that's a real tough one. The cute answer is to always say the next one, but I'd have to say, and you'd have to look him up in the book, Nick Long Jr. He's a dancer, but he was just an incredible athlete. He died on the Henry Hudson Parkway, if I remember the details correctly, around 1945 in a traffic accident. His parents were vaudevillians, but he lived down the block from me again, 109th Street. On that same block at different times, Dustin Hoffman and a couple other interesting people lived. But anyhow, Nick Long Jr., if you YouTube him, it may take a little bit of hunting and pecking, but you should be able to find a YouTube where it shows him in the big broadcast of, hope I get this right, either 1936 or 1938. It's a movie that has Jack Benny as a serious actor and a couple other actors you'd recognize. But in the dance scene, which was worthy of Busby Berkeley, he jumps over 8 chorus girls and lands off stage. And then in another scene, and I forget whether it's in the same movie or a subsequent movie, he broad jumps over 6 chorus girls, one at a time, without running. He just stands there, jumps over somebody, jumps over the next person, jumps over the next person. I mean, it's astounding what he does. And, you know, before we began tonight's presentation, Pam and I were talking about, somehow we got around, she had a connection. Harold Nicholas, the Nicholas brothers, who inspired Michael Jackson and so many people, Savvy and Glover, arguably the greatest tap dancers of all time. But you could, and he's in my book, Nicholas, Harold Nicholas is in the book, because there's a scene where he, in fact, I apologize for rambling here a little bit. He inspired Fred Astaire to do the dance, or not Fred Astaire, the other fellow who's in, Gene Kelly, to do that dance up the side of the wall or dance up the stairs or something. But in the YouTube with the Nicholas brothers, they're dancing and they're jumping over the jazz musicians as they're playing. I mean, it's just incredible. But Nick Long Jr. Does not disappoint. He does something similar in his scenes.
And Harriet.
Harriet? No. Oh, another favorite of mine, my director wife here just reminds me, is Harriet Brooks. Harriet Brooks is in the book, and boy, what a story that is. She comes out of Montreal, and up there, she studies under Sir Ernest Rutherford. Rutherford goes back to England. But she also befriends in New York City, Maxim Gorky. And another time she goes to Europe and she befriends Marie Curie. And in fact, as I write her up, she's the first really nuclear physicist, first woman nuclear physicist in the United States. And she's teaching at Barnard. And she announces to the dean at the time, Dean Gill, that she just got engaged. And then the dean tells her, well, then you've got to leave. You can't be a professor here at Barnard and be engaged or be married. So she goes back to Montreal. She marries a physicist professor, but she's long forgotten. And what an astounding person she was. So I'm still trying to think of the person that I wish I could have put in the book that didn't. There were a couple of people. I was hoping Pat Boone, who went to Columbia. He's similar to Barack Obama, President Obama. President Obama started his undergraduate work at Occidental College out in California, and then came to Columbia and finished up. Similar with Pat Boone. He went to some college, I think in Kentucky. He's a relative or descendant of Daniel Boone. But he came to New York with all of his celebrity and finished at Columbia University. I was hoping he might have lived in the neighborhood, but he didn't. He lived out in Lodi, New Jersey, with Enrico Fermi and a whole bunch of other famous Colombians. But I couldn't get him in the book because he didn't live in the neighborhood. So, Michael, any more questions? If not, I'm going to thank everyone again.
So we have 3 more.
Okay,
so
good.
We have, what's the biggest surprise that turned up in your research? I guess we'll start with that. The
biggest surprise that turned up in my research, right off the top of my head, was Amelia Earhart. I could qualify that with one other, but we'll leave it at that. Amelia Earhart, I didn't know she lived in New York. Not only did she live in New York, but she went to Columbia. Not only did she go to Columbia, but she went twice. She never matriculated. She never registered. She just took courses at Columbia. I think, and if I remember the years, 1920 and 1926. And I forget the exact address, but it was on West 124th Street, right between what is Morningside Avenue, and at the time probably would have been Amsterdam Avenue. So it's a very minor stretch to include her, but I thought she was so astounding. She's on the cover, obviously. So that was a big surprise. I had to do some deep research to pin that down.
That's interesting, yeah. Can you say anything about Cy Adler and the development of the Greenway from the Great Saunter?
Yeah, Cy Adler's in the book, and I know Cy Adler. It passed a few years ago. We actually had coffee once at the Hungarian pastry shop together. Most people might know Cy Adler from either one of 2 prominent ways. One was he organized shore walkers, where they do walks ostensibly along the shores, but they get very creative and cover all the bridges, walking across all the bridges. And once a year, they do the so-called Great Saunter, where they walk around the island of Manhattan, 32 miles. In fact, the year I did it, myself and another fella whose name was Casey Jones, hard name to forget, he and I finished first. It took about 12 hours. So Cy Adler did all of that. And the other thing he might be known for is his book, From the Bat to the Bear. And that's his plan to have a walking path from Battery Park, Lower Manhattan, all the way up to Bear Mountain. That never got fully realized, but I'd like to think some of the effect of that was just to try to make the loop around Manhattan much more continuous. It's almost there. It's not quite there. I think it's missing about 2 miles worth. I could be wrong on that. But since it gets you to the High Bridge Tower, that gets you over to the Bronx. And from the Bronx, I've never done this, but you walk about, I'm guessing, half mile to a mile, and you're on the Croton Aqueduct walking path. And from there, you get into Van Cortlandt Park. And from there, you get into the old Putt Trail, and you'll get up to Brewster, New York, 50 miles north of New York City. And there's a plan to connect that to Poughkeepsie, to the walkway over the Hudson. So I'm rambling with all this stuff because I think Cy Adler is an inspiration to a lot of this stuff.
And Leo wanted to know if you ever consider a project about residents who are notable for their presence on the Upper West Side itself. More of like characters like the mayor of the Upper West Side, as well as community activists for future talks.
Well, there's a lot of community activists in the book. Doris Rosenbaum comes to mind, but there are others. Wherever somebody's name is on a sign or maybe gratuitous to a building, like William Fitz Ryan, the Ryan Community Center, but there are more. I'm forgetting the name of the woman who just passed recently, who lives in a building on Morningside Drive in about 118th Street. And I think she passed 100. But anyhow, she was a real strong activist. So, but there's a bunch of them in the book, and there's a bunch of them on the website too. Yeah.
What are some of the other famous scientists? I guess mentioned from earlier.
Well, I won't start going through the names, but I'll tell you this. There's a corner where Claremont Avenue meets 116th Street. It's a subtlety. Claremont Avenue meeting 116th Street, not Claremont Avenue meeting Riverside Drive, but meeting 116th Street. On that corner, there's a bunch of buildings, and there's a whole bunch of Nobel Prize winners, and they're mostly scientists. But I can kill two birds with one stone here and tell you one of my real favorites in the book, who was a scientist, is Joichi Takamine. He lived at 334, I'm forgetting, either 334 or 335 Riverside Drive. He was the fella who isolated, what's the drug, Janet, when you want to get excited? No, not even. No. when you're attacked, there's a chemical in your body that comes forth, and no, it's a natural chemical. Well, anyhow, he isolated that, but he was an extremely famous scientist in his day. He did a lot of stuff with cotton at the time. Being of Japanese extraction, he organized the Nippon Club, the building of which is still on West 93rd Street. He more than anybody else can get credit for bringing cherry trees into the United States, which famously were planted in front of our nation's capital, and even up in Sakura Park and Riverside Park. There's some of those trees that came to the United States on his behalf are still there. They're very aged, to be sure. He didn't bring in the ones in Branchbrook Park in Newark, but he did these other ones.
Jim, I believe it was oxytocin. Oxytocin.
Oxytocin.
No, the oxytocin guy, Sackler, Dr. Sackler, lived in our neighborhood. Yeah, he's in the book as well. I didn't want to bring him in because of controversy and whatnot. But he's another one who's in the book. He actually made his money from publishing a daily medical journal, a weekly medical journal. So there are scientists galore. There are architects galore. There's a fellow who is thought to be the largest person in the world at the time. If you have the book, you'll see that. Any other questions, Michael?
We have one person who's raising a hand to speak, and I will see. I will do that right now. Give me a second. Holly, go ahead. I think you should be able to speak now.
I didn't realize my hand was raised. Sorry. I just said this was wonderful, and thank you so much, Jim.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward to reading your book.
All right. We have Robert, who also wants to talk. I'll let him also see if he wants to have a question.
Jim?
Yes, Robert.
Hi, this is Bob Abramovitz.
Bob.
I just want to make a minor correction. When you're talking about the Sacklers, it was OxyContin.
Right.
Oxytocin is the tendon befriend hormone.
Aha.
It's what is responsible for forming secure connections between parents and kids.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
And the other drug you were thinking about is adrenaline.
Adrenaline, yes. Yeah. Joichi Takamine isolated adrenaline. Thank you so much, Bob.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for that correction. I hope the book is correct. I think it is, but yeah. The drug I was thinking about is a cure for erythrothrombomonoblastosis of the tibial tubule. Please don't write that down.
Yeah,
Michael, I think we've pretty much finished, and we should probably just reemphasize this. This will be on YouTube, right, in a few hours?
If not tonight, tomorrow morning, but yes, it'll take a minute.
Excellent.
And remember, our next presentation is on January 21
Excellent.
at
Excellent.
5:30.
Thank you all so much. This was so much
Thank you,
fun.
Jim.
Take care now. Bye.
Bye-bye.